All right, beginning as if nothing happened. Today we're going to continue our look at Chapter 2 research methods by taking a look at a couple of tools that are going to be used extensively to try to understand behavior. One of those is the Cumulative Recorder, which is a way of displaying patterns of behavior. And then the other one is specific single subject experimental designs that are often used to get to the causes of behavior, especially when you are not dealing with a large number of subjects, very typically in any sort of therapy situation. But before we get to that, let's go back and revisit the Learned Helplessness study by Seligman. So just a super brief recap, if you recall, in part 1, there were 3 groups of dogs that would be placed in rooms, and they had different contingencies in terms of their shock. So they had one group that received no shock, they had another group that had escapable shock, they could press their nose against the panel to turn off a shock. And then you had a third group that had inescapable shock, their panel did nothing, there was nothing in that room that would allow them to escape the shock. So that was part 1, and then in part 2, all of the dogs were placed in the same situation. So they were all placed in a room where a tone would sound, and then the floor would be shocked, and you could escape the shock by jumping over to the other side of the room. And what Seligman found was that Group A, who was previously not shocked, was able to learn the jumping response. Group B, which was previously in the escapable shock condition, was able to learn the jumping response. But Group C had inhibited learning of that jumping response. Many of those dogs failed to learn to jump to avoid the shock. All right, so we took a look at a lot of terms last class, so now let's kind of check in with those terms once again and see what we can apply to this situation. So for part 1 and part 2, what are the independent and dependent variables? So let's start off with part 1. So what is the independent variable? What are the aspects of this that the experimenter themselves manipulated and controlled? The shock. So the shock was 1, yep.
I was going to say the kind of shock each dog was given.
Yes. So the kind of shock that each dog was given is also one of the independent variables. So those are the 2 of them that were manipulated. It was the shock. So some of them were placed in shock and some of them weren't. So this one received no shock. These 2 received shock. And then on top of that, there was a second independent variable, which was the type of shock or the control that they had. So this one had control and this one had no control. So there were 2 things that the experimenter was manipulating, 2 causes of behavior, 2 independent variables. And what was the dependent variable for this one? Yep.
Was it the dog's response to the shock?
It was the dog's response to the shock. Specifically in this first part, it was the panel press. So nothing was measured for these dogs in terms of how quickly they learned, because there was nothing to learn. Nothing was measured for these dogs in terms of how quickly they learned, because there was nothing to learn. But they measured these dogs to see if they could learn how to press a panel, and sure enough, the amount of time that they were shocked grew less and less over time. All right, so that was part 1. Part 2, this one could be a little trickier, but for part 2, what was the independent variable? What was controlled between the dogs? Mm-hmm.
The shock. The ability to escape the shock.
Well, the shock, we'll start with the ability to escape the shock. In this case, the ability to escape the shock was not an independent variable because it was the same across all dogs. All of them had the ability. They could all jump over to the other side. They were all placed in the same situation.
So that would be your dependent?
Your dependent variable would be whether they jumped to the other side, for sure. This one's a little bit trickier because it's not, the independent variable is not in the experiment.
Is it their previous learning?
It's their previous learning. So in this case, their independent variable is their previous learning. So the only thing that the experimenter manipulated in stage 2 was what happened to these animals in stage 1. That's the independent variable. That's the only thing that differed between the groups. And then as we already mentioned, the dependent variable was the hurdle jump. Did they jump over to the other side? Did they learn to do that response? And as we saw, that was completely dependent upon their behavior. So it was completely dependent upon the dogs whether or not they chose to jump to the other side. Now, that ability to jump was caused by their previous learning. That's why it's the independent variable, cause and effect. But in the end, it was up to the animal, was up to the subject, was dependent on their behavior, whether they jumped or not. So these dogs over here could have just said, I've never been shocked before and I won't take it, so I'm protesting this and I'm not going to jump. It was possible for them to do that, but it was independent of their behavior that they were placed in that no shock condition. All right, next up, what are the stimuli and the responses? So in this case, there's a lot of stimuli, there's a lot of responses, but we're going to concentrate on the most salient ones, the ones that are key to the experiment. So in part one, what was the most, I would say, key stimulus? It was the shock. So the key event that caused behavior, that was the shock. And then what was the most salient or measured response? It was the stopping of the shock. It was the panel press. So that response, that behavior, that measured behavior, that looked at behavior, that key behavior was the panel press. And there would have been other behaviors, but that was the specific stimulus and response that they were looking for. And in terms of part two, what were the stimuli? There was two of them that were kind of key. Mm-hmm.
The tone and the shock.
In this case, it was the tone and the shock. So both of those were causes of behavior. And actually, as we're going to see later on when we take a look at punishment, typically you first learn to escape a punishment, and then later you learn to avoid a punishment. So in the beginning, the tone would sound, and the dogs wouldn't think anything of it, and the floor would get shocked, and then they would jump over to the other side. They would escape the shock. They would get to a point after a series of trials where when the tone sounded, they would associate that with the impending shock. They would jump before they were shocked, and in that case, they would completely avoid that punishment. In terms of responses, I've already alluded to it. What was the response they were looking for? It was the jumping to the other side. That was the key behavior, the target behavior that they were looking for. All right, overt and covert behavior. So this one's going to require a little bit of speculation in terms of what the overt and covert behaviors are. One of them definitely happened. So let's start with the overt behaviors. For part one, what was some of the overt behaviors that we either know happened or we would expect would happen? So pressing the panel is the one that we know would happen. What else would happen?
Group A not really doing anything, and Group C freaking out.
So things like freaking out, so things like whimpering, probably things like running around the room. There was probably barking. There was probably a lot of these different overt behaviors. And the key to these overt behaviors, again, is that they can be observed. So they could possibly be observed. So you can see a dog press a panel. You can see a dog walk. You can see a dog whimper. You can see a dog lie down. All of these are behaviors that you can observe. They are all overt behaviors. What about some covert behaviors? And this is pure speculation, but what might have been some of the covert behaviors? Mm-hmm. So feelings of pain, feelings of anxiety in Group B and Group C for the pain, I would say. Now, again, there is indications of covert behavior oftentimes with overt behavior. So pain is a very good example of that. Usually you can tell when somebody gets hurt because there's overt behavior that indicates that that person got hurt. So the person could be like, ouch, or they could be like, ah, you know, give you one of those. You can observe those. But I was in no pain when I did those. So you can't directly observe the pain. That pain is a covert behavior. Most emotions are covert behavior. Inner thoughts are a covert behavior. So all of these, you know, feelings of frustration, feelings of sadness, you might be able to observe covert behavior and infer or deduce that somebody's feeling sad. But you cannot directly observe that sadness. So that's an important thing to keep distinct, because sometimes you might get confused and say, well, I know when a person is feeling sad. Can't I observe them feeling sad? You can observe the outward behavior, but you can't observe that inside thought process or feeling. And actually, a lot of the challenge in psychology is developing measures of observing outside behavior that will allow you to measure that inside behavior. So it's very difficult to take a look at a person and see their intelligence, which is why so many hundreds of thousands of dollars have been invested into developing things like an IQ test so that we can SAT scores, so we can try to measure those inner abilities. All right, how about part two? We had some overt behaviors. What might have occurred in part two, things that we could observe. The hurdle jump was the one that definitely occurred. Other things?
No dogs from group C not jumping?
I guess not jumping could be considered an overt behavior. Typically, though, they're framed in terms of things that they do rather than not do. And that's going to be important when we get to the contingencies of positive punishment, negative punishment, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, because you have to start at a sort of status quo amount. So not jumping, I would argue, would be like the status quo amount, and then anything changing on that. So, you know, stuff like lying down might be an overt behavior that you could see. Definitely whimpering. Seligman also mentioned they had depressive-like symptoms, you know, so they would probably they started to move slower. There was a decrease in their energy output. So that would all be overt behaviors. And then once again, covert behaviors. I'm sure a lot of them started getting fed up with the shocking. Not something that you can directly observe, but behaviors nonetheless. So always keep that in mind, that a covert behavior cannot be observed. We might observe outcomes of that behavior. Those are overt. But if it cannot be observed, that's a covert behavior.
So would an outcome of the inescapable shock be like their adaptation to the shock? Like they got used to it, so they stayed there instead of jumping?
I don't know. You know what? I don't know if
see
they.
them not move, but you can't like see their feelings like a covert behavior against them.
Oh, okay. So that's what. Yeah. So their adaptation to it
Correct.
would be a covert behavior. Their ability to put up with it
Okay.
inside would be a covert behavior. And we're actually going to see, I believe this next class, a couple of covert processes. They're called the A and B processes, and they are reactions to outward stimuli. And you'll see that your inner body likes to stay where it is. So it actually has mechanisms that will turn down or turn up your responses to things.
Okay.
And you can measure that with overt behaviors like heart rate or galvanic skin response, like how sweaty your finger gets. But that sort of inner mechanism of turning down or turning up responses would be a covert behavior. All right, appetitive and aversive stimuli, part 1 and part 2. So for part 1, what is the, let's start with the aversive stimulus. What's the aversive stimulus? The shock. So the shock was an aversive stimulus. And the only reason that we know that the shock was an aversive stimulus is because of group B. Because group B actively avoided the shock. They went and they pressed the panel, and because of that, we know that shock is an aversive stimulus. Now, we could probably guess that going in, but it's important to remember that it's not what we think of shocks. It's not, what our projecting on the dogs, would think of shocks. It's always defined by their behavior. So if you were to ask an expert in the psychology of learning, and if you were to ask, is food going to be a reinforcer for this individual? Without any other information, they would say, I don't know. Or sorry, not reinforcement. Would food be an appetitive stimulus for this individual? Without any more information, they would say, I don't know. It might be appetitive, it might be aversive. Are they going towards the food, or are they going away from the food? That's the only way that you can define those. So keep that in mind. The only reason we know that is because of this group right here. So what would be a appetitive stimulus in this case? What was that? The panel. So in this case, the panel would be an appetitive stimulus. And what you'll find in experiments like this is that the dogs, the group B dogs, over the course of the experiment, in the beginning, they'll probably roam around the entire room. But near the end of the experiment, after a few trials, you better believe they're going to be camped out at that panel. And they'll just kind of be sitting there waiting for the shock. And as soon as the shock comes, they'll just kind of press the panel and they'll be done with it. So that panel, it was appetitive because they approached it. They actively sought it out. They actively came near to it. That's how we know that it's appetitive. For part 2, what was the aversive stimulus? The shock. So the shock was 1. What was the other one? The tone. So we have the shock because they actively avoided the shock. And as far as we can tell, we have the tone as well as an aversive stimulus because the tone occurred on one side of the room and they jumped over to the other side of the room. They actively went away from the tone. So based on their behavior and that description alone, we define the tone as an aversive stimulus. And when it got to the end of the experiment and they heard the tone alone, they jumped to the other side. They went away from the tone. So this is a nice example where I am sure, or I would imagine, I'm not sure, but I would imagine that in their minds, those dogs loved the tone. I'm sure they were very thankful for the tone because they were like, oh my goodness, thank goodness there's a tone there, so I'm not getting shocked. I love that tone. Oh, the tone sounded great. Love that tone. But they went away from the tone. So it was an aversive stimulus according to our definition. All right, and I jumped the gun. Appetitive stimulus in this case, it would be the hurdle or the other side of the hurdle. So during the course of this experiment, they probably spent more time close to the hurdle because again, they wanted to jump over it. And they actively went to the other side of the room, so they actively approached the other side of the room. And again, according to our definitions of appetitive stimuli, that means that the hurdle and the other side of the room was an appetitive stimulus. All right, so for part 1 and part 2, what are the temporally contiguous events? Events that occurred very close together. And what are the spatially contiguous events? Events that occurred very close in space. So close together in time for temporally, close together in space for spatially. So in part 1, temporal contiguity, what 2 events had high temporal contiguity?
Shock and
Yes, so the 2 events that had high temporal contiguity was actually the panel press and the end of the shock. So as soon as that panel press was completed, the shock was done. So in the beginning, there was a lot of time between the time the shock started and the panel press occurred, but throughout the entire experiment, as soon as they pressed that panel, shock was turned off. So that would mean that there was a high temporal contiguity between those 2 events.
Was there something that occurred before the shock, like the floor lit up or something right before the shock? something?
Not to my knowledge.
First part?
No. I would have to review it. It's been a while since I've seen the original experiment. But I think there was no warning for it. I think the floor was the source of the shock, but I don't think there was any warning or a tone or anything like that. I would have to review it though. All right, so panel press and the end of the shock were temporally contiguous, and I won't torture you with this one because we don't know what was spatially contiguous, right? We don't have a map of the room, which would be required in order for it to be spatially contiguous. Now, based on what I know about dogs, I would imagine that from the table up to here, they're about yay high. And if you want to have a panel press that they press with their nose, it would also be about that high off of the ground. So as close as the panel is to the floor where the shock occurred, the closer it is, the more spatially contiguous it is. The higher it is, the less spatially contiguous it is. And again, there's more learning occurring when there's high temporal contiguity and there's high spatial contiguity. So if that panel was right at the floor, the dogs would probably learn the association in fewer trials. And if that panel was pressed and then 5 seconds later the shock turned off, the dogs would take more trials in order to learn to press that panel because of the decrease in temporal contiguity with that 5-second delay. All right, part 2, temporally contiguous. The shock and the tone, and what else? The jump and the end of the shock. So the one that we know is definitely temporally contiguous was the jump and the end of the shock. So as soon as you jumped over to the other side, the shock was done. There was no delay. It's not like you jumped over to the other side and you have to wait 5 seconds before the shock got turned off. As soon as you did it, it was over. For the tone and the shock, we don't have the details on that. If it was something like, beep, and then shock immediately after, that would be highly temporally contiguous. If it was beep and then shock, that would be low temporal contiguity, harder to learn an association between those two events. And then spatially contiguous, what was very close together? And we got a diagram for this one, so if anybody remembers, yeah?
The hurdle in the space without the shock?
Yeah, so one of the spatially contiguous ones was where the hurdle jump was and where the end of the shock was. So those are very close together in space. In fact, they were touching each other, highly spatially contiguity, high spatial contiguity. And also, the tone in the shock. The closer that speaker was to the floor, the more spatially contiguous those two events would be. Because the floor was getting shocked, and if the tone is closer to the floor, if the speaker is built in low, that would take fewer trials to learn the association. If the speaker is higher up, that would take more trials, less efficient learning because of the increase in, or the decrease in spatial contiguity. All right, and finally, in this experiment, penultimately in this experiment, was a contingency between the shock and behavior for Group A, Group B, and Group C. So in part 1, we'll start off with Group A. Group A had no contingency because Group A had no shock, right? So there's no, the probable occurrence of this leads to the occurrence of this leads to the probable occurrence of that. So between the panel press and the end of a shock, what was the contingency for Group B? For them, what was the relation between the panel press and the shock? The panel press causes the end of a shock. So the panel press, that behavior, caused the probable outcome of ending the shock. In this case, in an experimental lab, that probability is 100%. Still the probable outcome. But you press the panel, you end the shock, that's the contingency for Group B. And Group C, on the other hand, was also under a contingency. This one's a little tricky. It was also under a contingency, but they weren't in charge of their own contingency. So they were still under a contingency. It's just that the event that caused the probable end of their shock was group B pressing their panel. So remember that they were shocked for exactly as long as group B, because group B's panel turned off the shock in both rooms. So they were under a contingency, but they weren't in control of it. It was that group B, that event causes the probable end, 100% in this case, of their own shock. And in part 2, what was the contingencies that the groups were under?
Jump to the other side to end in the shock.
Yep. So group A was under the contingency that the hurdle jump causes the end of the shock. Group B was under the contingency that the hurdle jump causes the end of the shock. And group C was under the contingency that the hurdle jump causes the end of the shock. Those were the linking of the event. So the occurrence of jumping to the other, the occurrence of the hurdle jump predicted the occurrence of the end of the shock. All right, and now finally, the functional relationship between the independent variable and dependent variables. We're only doing part 2 for this. So what is the final relationship? And this really, this is one of the ones where it can't really be shown mathematically or in graph form. So what were the contingencies? What was learned in terms of previous learning? So starting with group A, what was learned about the effect of the lack of previous learning on subsequent learning? Yes. So in this case, we can express that by saying that no previous learning leads to new learning to avoid a shock. All right? So that's the contingency. That is what the effect of no previous learning is on new learning. If you have no previous learning, you can still get new learning. What about group B? What happened with them? What did previous learning to avoid a shock do?
They remain the same.
They still jumped over the hurdle. They still learned.
They were still able to learn. That's the key one. So previous learning leads to new learning as well. So the previously learning to avoid the shock actually led to new learning to avoid the shock as well. And then the key one, again, the reason why this experiment had the impact that it did, was what happened with group C. So what was the functional relationship there?
Their learned helplessness led them to not learn to avoid the shock.
Exactly. So that previous learning that you cannot avoid shock, that learned helplessness, inhibits any new learning. So now we see the connection between a history of learning and new learning, and that connection is that functional relationship. Changes in your history are going to change your ability to learn new things. If you have no learning, or you have successful learning in the past, you'll learn new things. If you have unsuccessful learning, you won't learn new things. And that is the functional relationship. All right, any final questions on that before we move on to research methods and the new tools? All right. So again, as I mentioned before, what we're going to be doing today, the new stuff we're going to be doing today, is we're going to take a look at recording methods, specifically the cumulative recorder. This is a style of presenting information in terms of patterns of behavior that has been used by the psychology of learning. So it's important to know how to read those. And then we're going to take a look at single subject designs. And these are specific techniques and experimental designs that are used when you don't have a lot of subjects in your sample. And these are the techniques that are oftentimes used in treatment. When you have an individual client that comes to you, you design a treatment for them, and you want to know, is this treatment effective? And you don't want to wait until you treat 20 people with that same treatment, especially if you are tailoring your treatment for each individual. You need to have these techniques to know if your treatment is effective. All right, so research methods. So one of the measures of behavior that is oftentimes used is the rate of response. So how many responses per unit time does a subject or an organism perform? So that rate of response, increases and decreases in the rate of response, is often taken as evidence of learning. So an example of a rate of response, you might train a rat to press a lever, and they might do 12 bar presses per minute. And that's their rate of response. They got 12 bar presses during a certain period of time, 12 bar presses a minute. If you're an old-timey newspaper boy, you might deliver 40 newspapers in an hour. That's also a rate of response. The delivery of a newspaper is the response. You do 40 of those in an hour. If you can eat 15.9 buffalo wings per minute, then that's a rate of response, and you will be Joey Chestnut here, and he is one of the most successful competitive eaters, and I think this is, where did he go? It's one of the Wild Wings wing eating championships. Anyways, that's 190 wings in 12 minutes. That's a little bit of craziness, but rate of response, right? We have a certain number of responses per period of time. So he had 191 wings in 12 minutes, and I'm sure if we broke this down per minute, his rate of response changed across those 12 minutes. I'm sure it kind of just plummeted, by the time where he was probably eating 1 or 2 in that final minute. Or, maybe he's just a machine and he was doing it the whole time as fast as he can. All right, the last one, 4.3 steps per second. If you can take 4.3 steps per second and you're at full stride, well then you are Usain Bolt. And you are on your way to winning gold. I believe that was 2012. Yep, there it is, London in 2012. So he took 4.3 steps per second. We know this because people counted his steps. He took 42 steps in his 9.63 second win. And if you're wondering what's he doing all alone there at the finish line, it's because everybody else is way back there. And one of the reasons why he was so fast and he was able to beat everybody so soundly is because he is 6'5". He could do the entire race in 42 steps. Everybody else had to take 44 or more steps. So they literally had to do 2 extra steps in the same time. And you can see that that gap is huge. Incidentally, just to kind of understand the insane awesomeness of this human being, he did it in 9.63 seconds. There's only 12 human beings in recorded history that have run the 100-meter dash in 9.81 seconds or less, right? Only 12 individuals in the entire history. And everybody but Usain Bolt at some point in their career popped positive for performance-enhancing drugs. So yeah, just to kind of, and that's 9.81, right? That's all of these guys back here, right? So just again, it boggles the mind. I think he almost broke like the matrix barrier and ended up outside the program. Anyways, so why are we talking about Usain Bolt right now, rate of response? Well, rate of response is oftentimes used to measure learning, measure behavior. We're going to see later on that you can analyze patterns of rates of response to figure out different contingencies that people are on. But we're going to use this to illustrate the idea of the cumulative recorder. And the cumulative recorder is a tool that is used to measure the rate of responses over time by measuring the number of responses over time. So this is displayed as a graphic that depicts rates of behavior across a given time. So we'll see if the video works this time around. I'm going to pop in the audio here so we can enjoy that as well. Yeah, we got VGA audio. All right. Let's see. Are we going to get it this time? Hey, alrighty.
The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph.
Okay, so that graph is the cumulative recorder. And what this graph does is it's a huge ream of paper. So you can see, I mean, it's like just a massive roll of paper. And it would unwind, and it had a pen on it that would drag across the paper. And every single time the pigeon makes a response, the pen goes up. And then it continues to drag. And every single time it makes a response, the pen goes up, and it continues to drag. So you can see this going up and dragging right there. All right, so you can see the cumulative recorder right next to it.
The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered. Or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement?
The main thing is what we call.
All right, so that's what I wanted to show you, that cumulative recorder. So that was the way that he used to represent the behavior, patterns of behavior, rates of behavior. And when you saw that cumulative recorder, you would let the pigeon run, you wouldn't monitor the pigeon, you would let it run for an hour, and then you would come back. And you could literally take a look at that paper and be like, oh, okay, the pigeon was really pecking here and it slowed down over here. And this is an instance of one of those phenomena where this was the way it was recorded in the past, and it continues to be displayed in that way today. So we don't use those, you know, you'd be hard pressed to find a cumulative recorder that looks like that. But rates of response are still often represented in terms of that kind of cumulative recorder information recording. All right, so let's see what a cumulative recorder would look like, not for a pigeon that is pressing or pecking at a key, but let's take a look at what it would actually look like for, back to Usain Bolt and his record-setting run in 2012. So let's say that the behavior we were interested in was steps. So we were interested in steps, and we had recorders attached to his shoes so that every time he took a step, the recorder went up and up. So let's see a behavior that he produced. I knew it. Not today. Let's go to the link. Take that, YouTube. All right, we're probably going to get a commercial. Yep. Oh, this is great. Yeah.
We're talking about learning though.
Let's I know. We're advertising the competition though. All right, let's skip this ad. Okay. And notice he slows down. Like that's how bizarrely incredible it was. He looks back and slows down. So then he does his little celebration, he does his dance. And then he earns a good rest and goes back down to the locker room. All right, so that's his record-setting. That was his record-setting run. So what would that look like if we were able to have recorders in his shoes, if we were able to actually record those steps? If I'm able, there we go. If we were able to actually do that, what would his cumulative recorder look like? So the cumulative recorder, again, the key to this is that it's continually scrolling, right? So the line is continually being drawn. And every time a behavior occurs, it goes up a notch. And then it continues to continually be drawn. And then it goes up a notch and continues to be drawn. So whenever you see a flat line like this on the cumulative recorder, so this will be the paper unscrolling in this direction. So this line here got dragged across. When you see a flat line, that means that no behavior is occurring. So it doesn't mean that, let me be more exact about that. It doesn't mean that no behavior is occurring. It means your target behavior isn't occurring. Your response isn't occurring. So Usain Bolt might be doing a ton of things here, but the one thing for sure that he's not doing is he's not taking steps. He's staying stationary. So this would be the time when he gets into the starting block. So he's in the starting blocks, and he might be adjusting his hands, and he'll be looking around, and he'll be tensing up, and he will rise, to get into the start position. But the one thing he's not doing is he's not taking steps. And that is reflected in the cumulative recorder by this flat line that indicates no behavior being occurred. Then, all of a sudden, we have that. We have a sharp slope, sharp increase. So this is, every single time this goes up, is basically another behavior occurring. So this is multiple steps being taken. And because it's so steep, it means that it's multiple steps being taken in a very short period of time. So we got a whole bunch of steps in this small little period of time. That was after the gun sounded, and he was off and running down his 100-meter dash run. So this is the high rate of response here is shown by the high steep slope of this response. And then this is something that's a throwback to when the mechanical nature of the cumulative recorder in the early days is you will often see this occur. This drop here, you can ignore it. This means nothing except that the pen that was being used got to the top of the machine and then just automatically dropped down to continue recording. So don't think of this as anything like, oh, he all of a sudden slowed down or anything like that. No, he's going incredibly fast. The cumulative recorder reached its max. It drops back down. He is still going incredibly fast. So this is a pattern you'll see oftentimes. So look for the slopes going up, and you can ignore the slopes going down because those are just resets of the machine. All right, so then all of a sudden, this occurs. So we still have behavior going on. We still have these responses occurring, but notice that it's not as steep as it was here. So the slope of this has fallen down a little bit. It's gotten a little bit flatter. That indicates a slowing down of his response. So right about here was where he kind of saw that he was ahead of everybody and started celebrating a little bit too early. If you want to absolutely destroy the world record, even more so. But anyway, so we started celebrating, started slowing down, and that's indicated in the cumulative recorder because we have less of a slope here than we do over here. Then all of a sudden, we see this little cross mark. That cross mark, that's an indication of when the subject was reinforced. So in the pigeon pecking, on that cumulative recorder, every time food was delivered, there would be a little cross mark given on the recorder. It's typically up and down. I couldn't get up and down, so I've got side to side. But it's that little cross mark that indicates when somebody gets reinforced. So at this point, Usain Bolt got reinforced. And he got reinforced when he looked back at the clock and saw that he just annihilated the world record. And then immediately after that, we see another increase in his speed, and that would be when he starts celebrating his victory, so that burst of adrenaline, he kind of speeds up again in his celebration. And then that is followed by, all of a sudden, a stop in his behavior. So this flat line, once again, indicates that he has stopped his behavior. He's no longer moving, and this is when he does his bow and arrow celebration. And again, you'll notice he's doing a bunch of stuff, right? So he does that thing where he's like that, and then he does it the other way. And he's moving, and he's doing all this stuff. But importantly, he's not taking steps, right? He's planted, he's done. So for the entire time that he's not taking any steps, right? He's not moving his feet. He could be doing anything else. He might not be stationary, in this case he's not. But the cumulative recorder is counting his steps. So then we get a little bit more motion. Once again, another reset. A little bit more motion. And then we get no motion, or no steps after that, I should say. And that is basically when he takes his leisurely stroll. Should be a little flatter, I guess. But he takes his, well, he's a fast guy anyway. So he takes his leisurely stroll to the locker room, and then he sits down and, pops the champagne bottles and all that kind of stuff. And that's the end of that. So that would be the cumulative recorder that would output, that would occur if you were recording his steps during that 2012 London Games. And if you knew nothing about what had just occurred, but you know how to read a cumulative recorder, you would be very able to say, well, your subject wasn't taking any steps, and then he really took off, really went fast, and then he kind of slowed down, got reinforced, sped up again, stopped taking steps for a while, and then, slightly slower until he stopped taking steps for the last time, reading from that cumulative recorder. All right, so let's take a look now if we can do exactly what I just did, which is read a cumulative recorder. So I'm going to hand out, I got a handout here just to make it a little bit easier to work with this. So if you can pass those down, you can start using the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 4 cumulative recorders, and I'm going to show you 4 descriptions of behavior. And what I want you to do is I want you to match the behavior to the cumulative recorder, and we'll see if we can get those lined up. All right, so first behavior, and the handouts are coming. This is what's written on them. So behavior number 1, we have a naive rat. So a rat that hasn't previously been put in this situation, and they learn to bar press for food. He bar presses for a lot of food. He then gets full and stops. Later, he gets hungry again and bar presses for food once more. So we have a naive rat that is learning to bar press. Yep. So where do we have? We should have. Do you want to grab one? We still got to get to the middles. All right. There you go. It is on its way. All right, so we got a naive rat that is learning to bar press for food. After the rat learns, he bar presses for a lot of food. He then gets full and stops. Later, he gets hungry again and bar presses for food once more. You can consider the delivery of food to be the reinforcer. The bar press is the behavior. All right, behavior number 2. A student hasn't read any pages from her textbook. Reading pages is the behavior. 3 days before the exam, she reads 1 chapter. 2 days before the exam, she reads another chapter. The night before the exam, she reads the rest of the textbook. After finishing the exam, she doesn't open the textbook again. You can consider finishing the exam to be the reinforcer in this case. All right, a child who is afraid of falling is learning to ride a bike. Riding a bike is the behavior. Tentative at first. Once the child learns to ride, he rides every day until he falls down. After he falls, he doesn't get back on the bike. So consider bike riding to be the behavior. Consider the joy you get from bike riding to be the reinforcement. And then finally, a gamer buys a new game. She plays it every day until she reaches a level she can't complete. So consider playing the game to be the behavior. Frustrated, she plays less and less and eventually stops. One day, she finds a tip online that allows her to complete the level, and then she plays the game every day until she finishes it. So playing the game is the behavior. The reinforcement or the reward is the enjoyment of playing that game. So those are the 4 behaviors, and then you got cumulative recorder number 1. Sorry, cumulative recorder A. We got cumulative recorder B. Cumulative recorder C. And then finally, cumulative recorder D. So which of these goes with which description of behavior? I'll give you a few minutes to analyze those and figure it out. All right, so we got cumulative recorder A. So let's do this by show of hands. How many think this is behavior number 1? How many think behavior number 2? Behavior number 3? Behavior number 4? All right, awesome. This is behavior number 3. So this is a child who is afraid of falling, is learning to ride a bike. Tentative at first. So at first, we have the bike riding here. Doesn't do it very often, right? A little nervous, a little tentative, trying to learn how to ride a bike. Once a child learns, he rides every day. So that's that very frequent response here, very high rate of behavior. We're riding it once per day. Notice getting reinforced every single day for riding that bike, having a lot of fun riding that bike, until he falls down. So right there, no reinforcement. And then this is just coincidence. That's not him falling down or anything. But until he falls down, after which he does not ride, he doesn't get back on the bike. No bike riding indicated by that flat line. Very nice. All right, number B. So what is this? Is this behavior number 1? Show of hands. Behavior number 2? Or behavior number 4? All right, so this is actually number 4. So this one is very close to behavior number 1. And what distinguishes these is what happens near the beginning. Well, one of the ways to distinguish this is what happens near the beginning of it. So if you see in behavior number 1, it goes, a naive rat learns to bar press for food. Learning is often accompanied by an increase in the rate of response. But here we see that there's no increase in the rate of response. So this is behavior number 4. A gamer buys a new video game. So before she has it, no behavior, no playing the game. Once she gets it, she plays it every single day, until she gets to a level she can't complete. Frustrated, she plays less and less, so should we see a slowdown in her behavior until she eventually stops. And then one day she finds a tip online that allows her to complete the level, and then she plays every single day until she finishes the game, and then she puts it away. All right, cumulative recorder C, is that behavior 1 or behavior 2? So who thinks it's behavior 1? Behavior 2? All right, awesome. So a student hasn't read any pages. So this is the actual behavior is reading books. So no reading, no reading, no reading, no reading. And then 3 days before the exam, she reads 1 chapter, so we go up 1 notch. 2 days before the exam, she reads another chapter, so we go up 2 notches. And then the night before the exam, she reads the rest of the textbook, so we have a very high rate of behavior. After finishing the exam, she gets reinforced for finishing it. She doesn't open the textbook again. We got a flat line indicating no behavior. So the final one here, cumulative recording D, the one that's left over is behavior number 1. So much like behavior number 4, the big difference here is this initial increase here. So we have a naive rat learns to bar press for food. And one of the things about learning, or that's indicative of learning, is that increase in the rate of response. So originally the rat doesn't know that pressing the bar is going to give them food. So this might be the rat just brushing up against the bar with its butt and pressing it and getting some food. This might be the rat just kind of trying to climb the walls and falls down and presses the bar and gets some food. But eventually the rat learns to press for food, so the rate of responses increases, it keeps getting reinforced. But then the rat will will get full, starts to press less and less and less until it's full, and then it stops, and then it gets hungry again and bar presses for some more food once more. All right, very nice. So those are cumulative recorders and the ways of interpreting them and their rates of response. And that's going to become very important, especially when we get into the different contingencies, because different contingencies will lead to different patterns of behavior. And those different patterns of behavior, if you can identify them, can lead you back to the contingencies. So knowing the rate of behaviors can actually help you identify contingencies in a person's environment that led to that behavior. All right, so we're not going to have enough time to completely go over the last part of today's class, the single subject designs, but I do want to introduce the idea and introduce the need for the single subject design. So a single subject design is one where it's kind of right in the title. These are designs that are specifically for situations where you have one subject and one subject alone. So in experimental psychology, I'm typically in a situation where I can get hundreds of subjects. So I don't need these specialized techniques because when you're looking at a group of individuals, they don't get impacted by kind of little unique idiosyncratic events. But when you're dealing with a single subject, the potential is there. So these designs are especially important if you're going into the clinical field, if you're going into applied psychology. Oftentimes you're dealing with one individual. So if you're a clinical psychologist, somebody might come in, and the example we have is to stop smoking. Somebody might come in and say, I want to quit smoking, I'm having trouble. Can you put me on a program to help me quit smoking? And the last thing you want to tell that individual is, sure, I can put you on a program, I'll design a program for you, we'll make it specific for you. All I need 19 more people just like you to enroll in this program, and then we'll get underway once we get a nice sample of subjects. No, you want to say to that person, yeah, I'll make something for you, specifically tailored to your needs, and we'll treat you and we'll be able to start right away. That's the first thing you want to do. The second thing you want to do is you want to know if the treatment is effective. Because eventually, you're going to tell this individual, all right, we've curbed your smoking habit. From now on in your entire life, you stay on this treatment program, and your smoking will be ceased. Your smoking will be minimized. So we want to be able to say that. And the worst thing you can do is think you've cured somebody, but your treatment is actually ineffective. Because then you put them out back into the world, and they're vulnerable, and they'll relapse, and it's not an ethical thing to do. So we need to know, we need to be able to say, I've designed this new treatment for you, and because of these techniques that I've used, I know that it works. So I can now responsibly and ethically say, do this as your treatment, and your behavior will be modified correctly. So, how can we do this? Well, we're going to introduce today the way not to do this. So this is the ineffective, incorrect, unethical measure of doing this, and it's the single comparison design. And in the single comparison design, what you do is you measure the behavior of this individual in a baseline condition, and then you measure their behavior after you start treating them, and you compare the two. So you measure how bad their smoking is before you start treating them, and you measure how bad their smoking is after you start treating them. And the idea, and this kind of makes intuitive sense, is that if the smoking goes down after you started treating them, then your treatment is a success, right? That's exactly what we want. But it's not. It's not the case. That's not the conclusion you can come to. So let's take a look at why. So, what you would typically do, so we have, I chose this one, it's from the textbook, we'll go with this textbook example. So what you would do in a case like this is one of the first things you do, especially if it's not immediately harmful to the subject, right? So if they're no danger to themselves or no danger to others, what you would do is you would say, all right, we're going to start your program, but we're going to start it in a week. And what I want you to do is I want you for the next 7 days, smoke as much as you want. Smoke your regular amounts. And every single time you have a cigarette, just record it. So you have like an app on your phone, and every time you smoked a cigarette, you would, record it on your app. And that's what we have here. So that's your baseline phase. That's pre-treatment. That's before you even do anything. You're just measuring how frequent the behavior is. So here we have the number of cigarettes smoked. Here we have the days. And we can see that on average, this person seems to smoke about 15, cigarettes per day, right? So kind of like 17 on day 1, 15 on day 2, 14 on day 3. That gives us an idea of how bad the behavior is. It's also what we're going to compare our treatment to, right? We're going to compare to see if our treatment brings down the smoking. So this dotted line here, that's the beginning of treatment. So on the 7th day, he comes back, and you say, all right, this is what we're going to do. For your treatment, I want you to go to the bank, and I want you to withdraw $100 in $5 bills. And what you're going to do is every single time you take a cigarette, you're going to tear up one of those $5 bills, and you're going to throw it away. And that's your treatment. So this is actually a type of treatment that is done. This is an example of punishment in terms of treatment. But if you applied that, you might, and you tell him, and record how often you smoke. He comes back after a week, and the amount of smoking has gone down. So we would like to say that, oh my gosh, the treatment is effective. You know what? Continue to do this. Continue to have $5 bills with you, and every single time you take a cigarette, tear up your $5 bill and throw it away, because that treatment has decreased the amount that you smoke. We can't say that, however. So why is it that we can't actually say that?
Because you're comparing an individual to the same individual, so your subject is exactly the same as one person. So that might not work for another person.
Well, that's true. Your treatment might not work for another person, but it might not even be working for this person, right? So we would like to say that this treatment is effective for our client right now. But what's a potential other thing that could happen? Yep.
Like environmental factors, like something else like happened that caused them to stop smoking?
Yes, that's the key. Something else might have happened. All right, so this individual, something else might have happened during this week that is the actual cause of their decrease in smoking. So what might cause somebody to decrease their smoking for a week? Any speculation will do, yep.
In-laws are in town and they don't like when you smoke?
In-laws are in town, right? Maybe their in-laws on day 7 knocked on their door and said, oh, surprise, we're here, and we're going to visit you for a week, and we brought little Jimmy, and little Jimmy's asthmatic, so if you can curb the smoking, they're like, all right, fine, I'll curb the smoking. Other possibilities. Surgery. Maybe they were in the hospital for the week, right? And this is only as many cigarettes as they could sneak out after, they were surgery. Maybe they just didn't want to smoke because they were in so much pain, right? And I've done this example a few times, and one student once told me that I'm definitely not a smoker because I don't know how smokers think. So I don't know if that's actually what they would do. But maybe they were in surgery and they just didn't have access to cigarettes. Anything else?
They might be sick, like have a cold or whatever.
They might have caught a cold and your desire for smoking has gone down. Anything else? Yep.
They found weed.
Yeah, maybe they started smoking marijuana instead of cigarettes. They're recording how many cigarettes. They're not recording how many joints, right? That's a different thing. Maybe they met somebody new, and that somebody new was like, oh, one thing I can't stand is smokers. And they were like, well, I'm not a smoker. And now they're hanging out with them. Maybe the store that they buy their cigarettes from burned down. And is now, they have to travel out of their way to get more cigarettes. Maybe they lost their job, right? And they were like, oh, I got to cut back. Like, just financially, I just can't afford. We got to cut down on certain behaviors. Smoking is one of the first things to go. So the point is that something could have happened, right? Something could have happened, at this point here, and we don't know about it. So because of that, we cannot, with this design, with this pattern here, we cannot tell if it was our treatment, in which case it would be correct for us to say, you know what, this treatment seems to be effective, just keep doing it, and your smoking will go down and down. Or is our treatment ineffective and it was something else? Because this is not an issue with multiple subjects, because if we were treating a group of 20 individuals, and all of them showed this pattern, what is the case that every single one of them had in-laws drop by for a surprise visit on the 7th day? It's almost nothing. What's the case that all 20 of them met somebody that disliked smokers on the 7th day? Almost nothing. What's the case that 20 of them had surgery? What's the probability that 20 of them lost their jobs? Across 20 people, all of these factors just even out, and you're left with nothing but your treatment. But across one person, which is typical of a clinical setting, it's highly possible that something else happened. So we're going to need techniques to discover, is it something else or is it the treatment? Because the last thing we want to do is tell them, you know what, this seems to be effective, keep doing it. and then their in-laws move away, and their smoking comes back. Or they break up with their, with the person they met, and their smoking comes back. Or they land a new job, and their smoking comes back. Or the convenience store is rebuilt, and their smoking comes back, right? We don't want that to happen, so we have to know, is it the treatment? And this pattern here does not tell us whether it is a treatment. So next time we're going to take a look at what does tell you whether it is the treatment. And the first one we'll take a look at is the reversal design, and then we'll also take a look at the multiple baseline design. And these are techniques that you can use for a single subject to know if that treatment that you designed is actually effective. Other than that, any questions before we wrap it up? All right, that is it for today.